Okay, and we're live. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this evening, depending where time zone you are. I have the great pleasure to introduce Ian Thornton Trump, who is a cybersecurity professional and a CISO at Cyjax Limited. Welcome, Ian, for the show.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to spending this time with you and your audience and discussing some of the topics that they might find interesting.
So, Ian, I was just about to mention to you, like just prior to this call, is that when I done some research about you. Typically when I bring people to the show, they're very knowledgeable about certain topics, whether it's, endpoint security compliance, security awareness training and so on. But you seem to reinvent yourself over and over again. I've seen presentations about, some war stories, hacking exposed. I've seen you talk about GDPR, about, threat intelligence. And I even saw a pretty cool tweet that you mentioned what to do if you run out of toilet paper.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was cringing there for a bit. I don't know if you want to. So maybe we could start with kind of your background.
Sure.
Advertise your Twitter handle, and kind of we go from there.
Yeah, well, I'm at PHAT_Hobbit on Twitter. I try to push out like interesting content with usually a witty repartee, some sort of maybe sort of hook to get somebody interested, get the audience interested. I've got about 13,000 or so followers, and so I like to try and add a little bit of humor into what we're dealing with, because this job, the security industry, being in security right now is a tough one, both physical and cyber. And I guess I could say I grew up in a culture of security from being in the Canadian Forces in the military, and then also spending a year with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, although I didn't get a horse. So very much a culture of security that was focused on the basics and not really the cyber piece of the equation so much. But as we've sort of advanced in our in online and online content, I've definitely seen and followed some trends in going back to 2015, moving forward, when we had these two sort of very interesting things happen. I mean, the first was obviously crypto locker attacks in 2015. That took security to, I would say, into the limelight. And then at the very same time, we really had this huge push to do digital transformation, right? Like moving all of our stuff to the cloud and SaaS providers and all this kind of stuff. And so we had these two huge super trends, if you will. And we struggled, I think, on the technical control side, and then the governance and risk side. And, we've sort of ended up where we are today with a sudden massive effort to get more people online from the comforts of their own home because of the pandemic. So these three major forces all sort of combined during, I would say, the apex of my career, if I might be on the downward side of it by now.
I don't think so. Speaking of that digital transformation, which is a bit of a vague term, every time somebody says that, I think it means different things to different people. But in the context of cybersecurity, what are kind of the major deficiencies that you've seen? And you touched upon it briefly. Maybe you could dive a little deeper into what happened when everybody had to kind of work from home within, a very short period of time. And then, building these like fortress, these walls around, traditional security perimeter was no longer even an option. Maybe you can talk about that. And then, we're a year into it. Are we? I know it's
going
amazing.
So well.
What's changed? Do you feel that we've progressed from that initial shock of like everybody moving out and working from home? Anything changed since then?
Yeah, I mean it's been a huge space to kind of get our minds around. But let's back up a little bit and talk about what digital transformation means. It's code words for trying to get rid of our old shit that we want to put in somebody else's hands, right? And this was a great idea in theory until folks looked at things that they had done and went, we can put this in the cloud. But do you know that the compliance people need 7 years of data retention? Man, does that ever get expensive fast, right? And so one of the biggest impediments to cloud adoption has really been, how much is it going to cost? And I guess what happened was, we decided to embark upon this journey, and maybe there were some people that really understood cloud architecture and the costs of things in the cloud. And there were other parts of the organization that were just like, get it done. We got to be in cloud. Our competitors are in the cloud and our customers want us to be in the cloud. So it was like, all gas, no brakes, let's get to the cloud. Some organizations failed miserably because they weren't able to drag this tech stack that they had to the cloud. Other organizations said, we're going to accept a whole bunch of risk moving to the cloud because guess what? Our security perimeter, like you said, isn't going to protect the stuff that we have moved to the cloud, and we're not going to get the monitoring, and we're not going to get the compliance end of things sorted. And unfortunately, it was all too easy to plunk down a credit card and buy a bunch of servers and buy a bunch of hosting and buy a bunch of SaaS stuff and go to town without even letting your own IT department know that was going on. So we had this huge disconnect, and we built these silos, right? And guess where the threat actors struck? Right in between those silos. And man, they moved in there, and then because of the COVID and the conspiracies and the disinformation and all of that kind of stuff, what was unleashed was this tidal wave of cybersecurity problems and incidents. And we saw, ransomware demands went sky high. The near complete compromise of the IT ecosystem that was built on the SolarWinds Orion product. I was just joking the other day with Nicola Perlith that I'm waiting for the indications of compromise for the Iranians and for the North Koreans from the SolarWinds Orion product. So, we've got two APT groups represented. Where are the other two? So we're into this situation now where it was the perfect storm for advanced persistent threat actors to exploit, and of course, in their footsteps follows the cyber criminals with absurd ransomware demands, now topping billions of dollars demanded for an organization that's been compromised.
So let's touch upon a bit about that and kind of dive into the rabbit hole. I noticed that you provide that claim that partially the inflation of these ransomware demands are due to the insurance companies providing policies, right? And isn't it a bit of an oxymoron? I mean, you're getting in policy so you don't have to pay the ransomware or don't have to carry the entire cost of carrying it, but then the demands go straight up. That in turn increases the policy cost to everyone because the insurance companies are there to make money. They're not there's not pro bono, right? And then what happened is if some companies don't have insurance, or we have already seen that insurance companies, some of them back up, say, hey, you did not follow, didn't wear a seatbelt, right? Yeah. So now you're thrown out the windows and you crash out of the car. We're not paying for your health, for your recovery. So I don't know can you touch upon some of these topics?
Sure. I mean, the insurance market back in 2015 was pretty flat. The only growth you were going to get was when somebody was disappointed with their other provider. But along came cyber, and cyber was the only thing that was showing double-digit growth opportunities with the insurance space. So without really educating a whole bunch of underwriters in cyber and the liabilities associated with cyber, the insurance companies started writing policies. And unfortunately, with the way cybercrime has worked is, if there's more reward out there, then the money, they will follow the money. And so what essentially happened is everybody went to market and said, yeah, you need cyber threat insurance. If you have an incident, it can really land you in hot water. At the same time, in 2015 and onwards, we saw New York Department of Financial Services. We saw GDPR. We saw, the introductions of ideas around CCPA, increasing fines for unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. So now what we have is this full circle reality of you get a cyber attack, it puts your business on its knees, and attracts the regulatory scrutiny that could result in a serious fine. So you now have to pay out extra money, a lot of money. And in many cases, with regards to regulation, you can't use an insurance mechanism to pay for the regulatory finding, but you can pay to get your business back in business. And this is why it's now become an existential threat, is because we've seen companies go out of business because of a cyber attack. And there is no insurance in the world, if you're a law firm dealing with highly confidential information, like it turned into the Panama Papers breach, that you're going to be around. No insurance in the world can save you from that. So we're now in this situation of sort of the proverbial snake eating its tail. And the piper will be paid. I read an article that suggested there'll be about $90 million in cyber insurance claims made because of resulting from the SolarWinds data breach and resulting from companies having to rebuild their networks. It's a very difficult question because right now, unfortunately, you can blame any sort of cyber intrusion on SolarWinds, and everybody will just sort of accept it at face value. So we now have a situation where there's going to be a multitude of claims. You're right about the premiums going up. You're also one needs to also take a look at the powers of subrogation, which can allow an insurance company to seek damages for any claim that they've paid out. So there is going to be another shoe to drop, because there's going to be all sorts of litigation follow in the footsteps of these kind of supply chain data breaches, which we've now seen have affected Microsoft and the disclosure of potentially damaging source code from them. Of course, FireEye, Mimecast, and a number of other companies that were all seem to be victimized. And if those companies are part of your supply chain, then you really have to now dig down and figure out, okay, I now need to go into an incident response scenario to prove the negative, as opposed to assuming that any organization with those products installed has been breached. That's not the case, but you now need to prove to your customers, to your brand, to your board, that in fact you weren't victimized by these particular groups exploiting those particular pieces of installed software. So in short, TLDR, it's a mess.
Yeah, and it's not as simple. The onus of proof of the breach itself, as you mentioned, is complicated. The litigation is complicated. Lawyers don't really understand cybersecurity. There's a lot of nuances, right? Like, how do you prove that it was a SolarWinds, right? How do you prove that it was your vendor and that the actual breach happened due to that and not due to something else?
That's right.
That process is something that by itself, just the proof process is going to cost millions in some cases, right? Just to go ahead and prove that. And then who's going to pay for it? Is that at the end, is the consumers are going to end up, forking the bill, because it would be, an increased cost of doing business, right? These somebody has to pay for it. Again, the insurance companies they're not stupid. They're not going to raise the premiums, but also, at the end, someone will have to carry the responsibility and start paying for it. So, in your opinion, what are the insurance companies doing right now? When you buy a vehicle and it has etched serial numbers on the parts. It's got the airbags on the sides and so on.
Yeah.
You get reduction in premium, right? Because it's considered safer. Is there anything like that right now for companies that are looking to buy insurance? I'm assuming there is, but I don't know. Is that something that is ongoing and you see that increasing?
Yeah, so it's not managed at the front end like you're suggesting as nearly as it should. Okay, basically there is sort of a cybersecurity criteria, a best practices document that you attest to or you fill out in the course of your getting a quote for your particular business. If you are a little bit aspirational on that spreadsheet in your answers, then it's quite possible you will invalidate your claim and the insurance company will pay you nothing. If you are perhaps far more truthful about the current state of cybersecurity, there's a risk that they'll cancel your policy because you're too big a risk. On the back end of the business of all of this is folks that are pretty unknown, but they are the cyber underwriters and the risk management team. And they are not managing the risk of the organization. They are managing the risk of the customers of the organization. So, for instance, if you are selling, thousands upon thousands of cyber insurance policies, you want to have a makeup and understand what your level of exposure is. And unfortunately, with the increase in cybercrime, the level of exposure of businesses and the state of affairs of their security internally can be characterized as not nearly good enough to ward off an even the most basic cyber attack. So, it's sort of like the old models that we use, which were, if you're in an earthquake prone area, if you're in a flood prone area, if you're, in an area where tornadoes strike fairly regularly, then the cost of your insurance goes up, or the insurance company says, no, we're not going to make that coverage available to you, right? This is evolving in cyber. But the problem with cyber is we don't have a ton of data and risk models to apply for two reasons. One, we're not sure, like you said, exactly what patient zero of these cyber attacks are particularly well. The data that we have is limited. And then finally, we don't really know in a constantly changing landscape, okay, where a business is secure one day and completely insecure the next day, how to risk model that appropriately. So it's sort of like being in the early days of automobiles, to continue your analogy, where the only reason we found out seatbelts were a good idea is because people kept dying in car crashes, and we studied the problem for years upon years and years, and then went, seatbelts seem like a good idea.
And it took a while. I think cars
It
were already
did.
doing like 60 miles an hour before they decided it was a good idea to put seatbelts on. It was
Yeah.
always, even today, there's some states here in the US that it's totally optional.
It's
Just,
nothing wrong with the speed. It's the sudden stop at the
yeah,
end.
yeah, that's right. And then you touched upon a very interesting point, is that the state of affairs and kind of the risk perceived is dynamic, right? So you may acquire a company with all the infrastructure associated with it, and your footprint is very different,
Yeah.
right? You may be using software that just had a 0-day exploit, and now all of a sudden that increases your risk potential tremendously. You can even have a disgruntled employee. You have a layoffs of half of the workforce in the IT department, and all of a sudden you have the insider risk potential of somebody being disgruntled and carrying all your username and password and putting on Reddit. So all of that is very dynamic. So how do you? And you're right. I mean, the models itself are very archaic. I mean, we're talking about some of these, the way that insurance companies put together policies is very archaic. Maybe they should create almost like a dynamic policy. Maybe put on a blockchain, and where your premium changes daily depending on the situation. I mean, that's the only way I can see them solving the problem of fluctuating risk.
Yeah, and I mean, the problem is that a cyber attack on one business is, maybe a bit of a shrug of the shoulders, a large bill from a law firm, and carrying on. In another business scenario, it could be an existential threat. And unfortunately, where it is the most of an existential threat is in the mid-market, where you have firms that are living invoice to invoice, paycheck to paycheck, government bailout program to government bailout program during the pandemic. And they are literally, that's the life's work of the owners and the employees. And unfortunately, a cyber attack or bank fraud incident really puts them in an incredibly difficult place. They can't debt finance the organization. And in many cases, the personal assets of the business owners could be at risk of forfeiture in order to keep that as a growing concern. So we do have a number of imbalances, like you said, the risk piece, the dynamic nature of the risk, and then, of course, the level of financial accessibility to various organizations. I mean, some of the most devastating attacks have occurred on not-for-profit organizations, which literally are taking the mouths out of the people that need those funds the most.
Yeah, and we're also seeing the impact on healthcare providers and so on, right? There was was it like somebody who died because they could not be operated on due to attack on some of the medical equipment?
That was in Germany, which is interesting, in itself. It was a case where the systems were compromised, and the system wouldn't allow for certain codes and procedures to be enacted. It is a tragic circumstance. Just recently, what would a successful poisoning of a water supply in a town look like in terms of tragedy? So the thing I think that became the most difficult in this cyber piece in terms of managing and understanding risk is the fact that the connection between the physical world and the IT cyber world has, converged to the point where, a threat actor on the other side of the world can affect our day-to-day lives. And that's something, again, that, when we talk about the way the justice system and the regulatory system and then the insurance systems are trying to come to grips with that, it becomes a real challenge to use the practical approaches that we've been using since, banks were being robbed in the United States back in the late 1800s.
Yeah, totally. And some of it has tremendous risk, right? So in a sense that you kind of know where it starts, but you have no idea where it ends. I mean, Maersk was, the shipping company was completely disabled globally.
Yeah.
I mean, the amounts of money that potentially they've lost was in the hundreds of millions. And, it started from ransomware attacks. It's almost, and then now we're talking about poisoning of, let's say they wanted to have insurance on what would happen with a cyber attack on a water supply. I mean, how can you quantify now potentially thousands of people dying from poisoning? I mean, that by itself is tremendous risk to, to the business, which is, it's almost like, okay, how do you insure for, for an asteroid hitting? It's almost impossible because, how can you quantify that risk? So anyway, so that's something we have to reconsider in how we do business, moving forward.
I think we do have a model, though, to go back and to start looking at. Mm-hmm. So when it was decided that that pollution bad, the United States enacted the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce it. And interestingly enough, the EPA, of course, got involved in the Volkswagen malware that was inserted into various models of Volkswagen cars to defeat California emissions testing. This, to me, set up a model that may need to be adopted in terms of enforcement, because the EPA had essentially unlimited powers when it came to enforcement, both criminal and tort, against Volkswagen. They had the ability and capability under law to actually end Volkswagen as an entity. They could sentence Volkswagen to death. Instead, they chose to extraordinarily largely fine Volkswagen, one of the largest fines ever, and throw senior executives of Volkswagen into jail. That was pretty dissuasive, I would say, and certainly changed the character of a number of organizations. It certainly sent a message that they were very serious about the environment. The question is, are we as serious about the cyber environment? And if so, do we need something that is, I would say, so aggressive when it comes to identifying and pursuing not, something bad happened to us, not an accident, but true malfeasance and true negligence. And I think that's where we're going, where there's going to have to be a minimum data protection standard in the United States, and that it needs to be audited against, and failure needs to be as severe as what happens when you spill a whole bunch of battery acid into pristine wilderness environment. It's going to come down to that, I think.
And I think that model is already established successfully in some areas. For example, you don't rarely hear anymore about money laundering due to to the very, very high consequences of doing that. So the companies of financials are very, very serious about that. There's a question here before we kind of jump into the next question. There's a question here from the audience. Based on data and the trends we now have, is cyber insurance a convenience or a magnet for ransomware actors?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I don't think firms are putting up that they have 100 million in insurance for cyber events, because definitely I think that would be a magnet. I just think that when you do the math and you see the annualized growth of cyber insurance policies, and in especially the higher end of the mid-market and enterprises, the bad guys know that those policies are being carried, and they do know that their business model will allow for the extraction of millions of dollars from an organization that has failed to protect itself. And I think there's another aspect to this as well, is that the cyber insurance opportunity space is important to consider, because ultimately, in order to pay the regulatory fines, your entity has to continue to do business. So it's, again, operationalizing a data breach cost is precisely what insurance is supposed to do. But in my mind, it's sort of like it needs to be the last resort. It needs to be the break glass approach, rather than the we're just going to bury that cost of that data breach because we're going to make an insurance claim. And I do think that it's not the first insurance claim that the problem will be manifest. It's the second or third or fourth or fifth insurance claim that some organizations will inevitably end up paying out because they don't get it. They're just not prepared to make that investment. And so I think that's where the double-edged sword of regulatory action and shareholder, I'm going to say class action and customer class action will come home to roost. I mean, once it's kind of being unlucky and, okay, we're sorry, we're going to improve our ways. Second hack, ooh. Third, now you just look stupid.
Let's dive deeper a bit into regulatory environment, right? So we're coming to the anniversary, 2-year anniversary of GDPR.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where are we?
Well, it's interesting. Where are we is in the middle of a pandemic. And right now, people are not really talking about compliance with data protection policies. They're talking about trillions of dollars required to support their economies that have been ravaged by the pandemic and the closing down of the service industries in Europe, the United States, and other countries. So it's not a particularly hot or sexy topic. And one of the things that's very interesting about how this has all played out was that when you looked at the initial announcements of the Ticketmaster data breach penalty and the BA data breach penalty that were, $100+ million, we now have seen them quietly settle for 20 million, simply knowing that those two industries, the events industry and the airline industry, will be lining up for large government handouts. And what the regulatory authorities want to appear as is pro-business. And that's incredibly difficult to do when you're levying fines against organizations for data breach in the midst of a pandemic, where their ability to make the money to pay the fine is significantly curtailed. So again, it's the perfect storm to take the bite out of the regulatory authorities. And under a perfect business model where everybody's making tons of money, the economy is going well, travel is up, people are going to events, $100 million fine is appropriate. But during the situations that we find ourselves now, it looks far more punitive to industries that are looking for government bailout just to survive and keep people employed.
Very interesting. So do you feel that there's a version of GDPR that being established in California, and I think the other states are going to follow through. What do you think are eventually if things are going, are they going to adopt kind of GDPR like compliance regulations to do business globally? It'll be one standard, or again, it's going to continue being very disjointed, where every state, every country will have its own, which creates enormous difficulties for any type of international organization today.
Yeah, this is sort of the problem with GDPR, because when you talk about data privacy and you talk about that you have a fiduciary responsibility to protect unauthorized disclosure of sensitive data, that sounds very good. But what we don't have is a minimum data protection standard. We have ISO 27001, we have NIST, we have the CIS 20, we have five at the top five security controls as defined by Cybersecurity Essentials. We have a lot of different standards. And so it's sort of difficult to point to the failure of a security control when we don't really have a global standard. So it's one thing to sort of regulate, and say, oh, you've been bad and you've had an unauthorized data breach disclosure, but without any sort of technical audit control standard, we'll continue to run around doing the least worst job we can do in terms of investment in cybersecurity, because we're playing a game of numbers where we just hope that our organizations survive an encounter with a ransomware group, or God forbid, an advanced persistent threat group.
Yeah, and it's also there's the kind of the notion that GDPR benefits the large players, because they have the ability to deal with it, and then the kind of the SMB, smaller type organization, they don't have the means to enforce it any way, shape, or form. So maybe that standard you're talking about will be more inclusive to all organizations, not just the large ones with the ability to have somebody responsible for compliance, because the majority of SMBs are just trying to survive. And definitely, they'll be lucky to have an IT manager, let alone a compliance manager.
Definitely. And this is maybe one of the things that goes back to the thing we talked about in terms of everyone was going to the cloud. If you have a very insecure application on premises, you gain the benefit of that perimeter defense that you've probably had in place for 10, 15, 20 years. When you take that incredibly vulnerable application and you put it into the cloud, all you've done is moved it from a secure environment to a very insecure environment, because just because it's in Amazon or Google or Microsoft does not make it magically secure and compliant. And this was one of the other sort of like smoke and mirrors moves that I've seen organizations do, is they're claiming that they're NIST and ISO certified when the only thing that's ISO certified is the actual tin that their application is on in the cloud. And they're claiming that all of a sudden they're ISO certified because they've moved their application to a cloud hosted provider that's ISO certified. That's not how it works, right? And this is this goes back to the other way that the system has been sort of bastardized, is with PCI DSS, which has been a standard that's been around for a very long time. And again, organizations are not looking at the PCI DSS. They're saying, oh, we've got a credit card gateway. It's our credit card gateway provider's issue to be PCI DSS compliant. And no, it's not, is the answer that comes back. And you will find that out when you have had a breach involving your credit cards or payment processing system, and it will be a rude awakening for you. So it's like this game that's being played where it's not fair, because enterprises that get breached can go and sell corporate debt in order to get out of that breach situation. But in the mid-market, those mechanisms are unavailable, and the option could be to close doors. And that's how stark it is.
Yeah, and that's also the case now with it seems like COVID-19 has had a tremendous hit at the mid market as well, the small and mid market. Yeah. It seems that they were not as ready to move to digital, and they're not faring as well as some of the larger ones. Listen, we're kind of running out of time, and I just want to finish in a kind of a more of a positive note. We talked about a lot of like heavy topics and no, but this is great. This is the whole point of doing this. What are kind of the kind of things that you've seen it improved? And if you fast forward, like we're making progress every day. So if sky is not falling, we're still doing business. GDPR or not, with this ransomware, the companies are coping, some better, some less, some are paying, some are not. You do see these, these ads or like, titles of companies that are breached on a daily basis, but, we are still here, right? Yeah. So, do you see things that we are kind of advancing in the way we do them? And, that you look at like the next, 90 days and then maybe post-COVID, the things are going to maybe prove things that we could learn upon, and, lessons learned from this whole, crisis?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, if there are firms that are paying attention to all of the resources that have been released about this, especially in the United States from CISA and other organizations, the level of disclosure of what has gone wrong for organizations and kind of like how the bad guys got in is just a huge lessons learned. I mean, your threat model should be the Verizon data breach report and all of the CISA analysis of, organizations that have been waylaid by cyber criminals. This is important stuff. So if more people are paying attention to things like threat intelligence, which is ultimately what those documents are, we'll be far better off. One of our brothers and sisters on this show mentioned patch management enforcement policies. Patch management is hugely important in your organization. It needs a risk-based approach, though. And I think the two major things that we're seeing in terms of trends are: understand what your attack surface is. What do you have exposed to the internet? Everyone, I think, can agree that remote desktop protocol on an older box, like a 2008 server box, is a terrible idea to have it available to the entire internet, right? And then because we discovered that people's passwords are a huge problem, because if they're using summer123, there's a good chance they're going to use fall123 because nobody can spell autumn. And so we know what the password problem is out there. And what I'm going to say is put the white flag of surrender up in your organization when it comes to passwords, okay? Allow your organization to use whatever password that they want. Don't change them arbitrarily. But for goodness sakes, adopt multi-factor authentication. If we can get to 100% MFA in an organization, Microsoft, not Ian, but Microsoft says you got about a 99.9% chance of not getting hacked. So guess what? Seems to me like that's the way the ship should be sailing into calmer and more secure waters. And figure it out, guys. We're smart. We've been at this for quite some time. If you have apps that can't understand multi-factor authentication, then life cycle them out or put them in an environment where you can apply it properly. And for goodness sakes, just don't leave stuff open to the internet that gets found on Shodan and owned by bad guys.
Yeah, just back to the basics. We talked
100%.
about on the show. There's so many things that are, and they're relatively inexpensive to do as well. There's tons of MFA solutions out there that cost nearly nothing, if not nothing at all. It's just a matter of turning them on. Ian, it's been a real pleasure. I'll keep on following you. I know you're in the UK now, but hopefully when things open up, you're more than welcome to join us in New York City when the things are going to open up again. Where can people find you if they want to interact with you? What's the best way?
Certainly I'm on Twitter, at @fat_hobbit. LinkedIn is always cool as well. And I'm always glad to talk to people. I love New York City. I've been there on numerous occasions for some of the information security events and shows, and it's always wonderful. And I find all the people there very friendly, actually. I've never had an encounter with the angry New Yorker. So maybe I'm really lucky. But yeah, I mean, somebody put up a quick question there, and let's jump at it and say, what about privileged access management? 100%. Everyone should not have local administrator policies on the box, right? Figure out how to deliver your applications securely using the least amount of privileges required. I think that's super important. And it's one of those things, that comes in the operating systems that most businesses are using with Microsoft Windows 10 and the newer versions of Server. I was joking the other day and I said, Microsoft has it's taken a operating system and turned it into a security system with an operating system built on top of it. There's so much value in that operating system now from security. And like you said, David, you just got to turn it on.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks for everyone all for joining. And looking forward to seeing you in the next session. And Ian, thank you again for joining the group. It was real pleasure. Thank you again.